Generation 5 holds a very important place in the Pokémon franchise. Between the profound storytelling that set the standard for future games, the numerous features and additions that altered the competitive landscape, and the major mechanic changes that are still mainstays to this day, Gen 5 has made quite the impact. Especially when you consider that Black and White introduced a whopping 156 new Pokémon, the most of any generation to date. What's even crazier is that a vast majority of the Pokémon introduced are actually quite good. More than any other gen thus far, it's challenging to call out a Pokémon as being genuinely bad. The addition of reusable TMs alone makes a huge difference, as now there's no concern of wasting a good TM on a subpar Pokémon. Not to mention items like the Eviolite, which is one of many tools that can help the average Pokémon fare much better. But with that all said, if you do enough research, you can always find a few Pokémon that Game Freak did dirty that can't be considered anything other than the worst. Today I want to highlight these Pokémon and tell you why I think they're the worst of their generation. But before getting started, let's lay out some ground rules for what makes a Pokémon one of the worst. While I could make my choice off of just base stats, my definition of worst is based on a variety of factors like the ones listed on screen. Pokémon can be considered bad for a variety of reasons, and I want to highlight a range of these flaws as opposed to just dunking on Tynamo for having a low base stat total. In addition to this, I'm only using Black and White in my assessment. I like judging Pokémon based on their debut, and Black 2 and White 2 have several features that can influence a Pokémon's performance. Along these same lines, I'm also not considering any version exclusives between Black and White, as you can always argue a Pokémon is worth using because of its exclusivity. Of all version exclusives, Whimsicott and Mandibuzz are the only ones a bit on the fence, but overall I still think they're better than those that made it on the list. Last thing before getting started, just keep in mind that when I call a Pokémon one of the worst, that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. I know that may sound stupid, but whenever you rank things, something has to be at the bottom, regardless of how it performs. The worst competitive Pokémon in the OU tier are still in the OU tier. Alright, that covers everything on my list, so let's take a look at the worst Gen 5 Pokémon. Starting off with what I know is going to be the most controversial entry, here we have Serperior. I know it seems crazy to put a starter on the list, but when you take a good look at it, Serperior was simply set up for failure. As a starter Pokémon, Snivy has a lot of the same problems that Chikorita does back in Gen 2. Black and White are very unfriendly to grass types. Chili, Berg, Skyla, and Bryson are all super effective against you, Drayden and Iris both resist grass, and Elisa has 2 Emolgas and a Zebstrika with Flame Charge. That leaves only Lenora, who you have a neutral matchup with, and Clay, who easily has the toughest ace of any gym leader. Then between the Elite Four, N, and Getsis, only 5 Pokemon are weak to grass. So based on that alone, the Snivy line has an uphill battle throughout most main fights. This issue is only more evident when you realize that Serperior is meant to be a defensive Pokemon. This may not seem like a bad thing at first, especially looking at Serperior's stat spread. 95 for both defenses is pretty solid, and 113 speed makes it one of the fastest in the generation. Those stats may be nice, but they don't necessarily make up for its poor offense. 75 in both attacking stats is quite bad and makes Serperior weaker than Sunflora, Carnivine, and even Weepinbell. These stats also make Serperior the weakest fully evolved starter Pokemon, as every other one either has higher physical attack, special attack, or often both. And I think anyone who's used Serperior in-game will agree that its lack of damage output is very noticeable. And this issue is only exaggerated by the fact that Serperior's move pool is extremely limited. Through level up, you only ever get normal or grass type attacks, and the only TM coverage you get is Aerial Ace, Dragon Tail, and Rock Smash. It's obvious they wanted to emphasize Serperior's defensive capabilities, but the reality is, Serperior isn't even that great of a defensive Pokemon. Base 75 HP really averages out its defenses, and unless it's a resisted hit, which are pretty rare to come by, you'll still take a decent chunk of damage. Also, everything I'm saying right now just applies to Serperior. In the early and middle game, Snivy and especially Servine can almost feel like a chore to use. So much of the mid game became finding an opportunity for Servine to shine, of which there were few. Now, I won't pretend like Serperior is absolutely terrible. It has a couple decent matchups, and it gets a nice variety of support moves like Leech Seed and Coil that can help offset your lack of damage. Plus, its high base speed is extremely helpful and can sometimes make the difference between winning and losing. But you know what else makes the difference between winning and losing? Actually doing damage. It seems Game Freak realized the disservice they did this Serpent as they gave it the hidden ability Contrary in Gen 6, which instantly made Serperior better. And I'm happy they did because I've loved the Snivy line ever since I chose it on my first playthrough of Pokémon Black. But even back then, and especially now, I know that Serperior just doesn't hit the mark. Except in design, that is. Going from the most debatable pick to the most obvious, here we have Watchog. Now I think we can all agree that Watchog is a bad Pokemon, so let me start by highlighting the few good qualities it has. Patrat is available on the first couple routes, making it really easy to obtain. Plus, between Stab Tackle, Bite, Bide, and even Crunch at level 16, Patrat has a great move pool for getting through the early game. It even evolves at the low level of 20 and is quite the formidable Pokemon if you can get it early enough. Now, question for you. What did you notice about all those positives I just listed? The answer, it's all based on the early game. Watchog is a Pokemon you're meant to pick up early and eventually trade out for something better. This is more than apparent when you look at its stats. 85 attack is really nice early on when you're facing unevolved Pokemon, but the second you face tougher opponents, Watchog simply falls off. By the time you hit the Elite Four, you might as well use a Roggenrola with Sturdy, as you know you'll get at least 2 turns with it, which is more than I can say for Watchog. And with all the other stats under 80, Watchog is essentially the kid you invited to the sleepover because your mom told you to. He's unwanted. Even with utility moves like Hypnosis, Confuse Ray, and Super Fang, there's really no value to keeping it around. Being normal type doesn't help its case either, since you never have a positive matchup, and its lack of resistances makes its already bad defenses that much more noticeable. In some ways, it can even hurt you to keep Watchog on your team. Patrat can either have the ability Keen Eye or Runaway when you get it, and if you get one with Runaway, your Watchog will end up having Illuminate for its ability, which increases the chance for wild encounters. Fun fact, this is the only ability that's harmful to the player's wallet, as all it does is make you want to use Repels that much more. I feel like by this point I've probably said more than enough about Watchog. Most of you probably nodded your head the second I read its name. Hey, maybe you even fast forwarded to the next Pokemon and you're not even watching this. But if you are watching this, be sure to drop a like. My dog and I would both appreciate it. Plus, every like equals 1 Watchog that's removed from existence. Hashtag make Watchog extinct. The next Pokemon is one I personally enjoy, as its claim to fame in recent years has been being the most forgettable Pokemon, which ironically has made people remember it more than ever. Here we have Maractus. Of everything on the list, Maractus is quite the mixed bag. It's only obtainable in the Desert Resort, which is an area you can skip over the first time through. Plus, it's only a 10% encounter rate. This isn't even close to the worst I've seen in this series, but it does make Maractus a Pokemon you can miss entirely unless you're trying to find it. But let's say you do capture one. What you're left with is, like I said, a mixed bag. Looking at its stats, 106 special attack is quite good for launching off grass type attacks. And I do mean only grass type attacks, because outside of Hidden Power and Round, the only special attacks Maractus gets in Black and White are grass moves. And as I already mentioned, grass types tend to struggle in these games, so that's not necessarily a big draw. Looking at stats again, everything else is pretty underwhelming. 86 attack is decent, as there's a few moves you can use to take advantage of it, the biggest of which being Sucker Punch. Plus, this means Maractus on both sides hits harder than Serperior. But it has the opposite problem of Serperior, where its decent attacking stats don't make up for its bad defensive stats. By the time you reach the late game, Maractus feels very frail. Plus, with only base 60 speed, you're almost always going second, meaning you can maybe get off one attack before going down. But again, if that attack is grass type, yeah, I think you get the point. Maractus has the problem a lot of single stage Pokemon do, where it's not inherently bad, but it isn't good enough to consider using. Especially because if you really wanted a grass type in Black and White, there are so many better options that I would genuinely recommend. Maractus has some redeeming qualities, such as Water Absorb for an ability, being in the medium fast experience group, and a pretty interesting shiny. That last one isn't relevant, but I can almost guarantee none of you have seen a shiny Maractus, so you're welcome. Like I said, Maractus is just a mixed bag. But with a lot of steep competition in Gen 5, there's really no way around it. Maractus is one of the worst. Part of me feels a little bad for this next entry, as it makes 3 straight generations of Pikachu clones making the list, but I've also developed a mild hatred for this Pokemon, so I don't feel that bad. Here we have Emolga. There's a lot to say here, so let's start with the biggest issue, being stats. 75 in both attack stats. Now where have I seen that before? In all seriousness, I don't think a lot of explanation is needed for why these stats are bad. It doesn't hit that hard, and it's frailer than both Maractus and Watchog. This leaves it with just a good speed stat, which is nice, but not nearly enough of a reason to use it alone. But before even worrying about Emolga's stats, you first need to worry about obtaining it. Gen 5 introduced a new method of encountering Pokemon, being rustling grass. One of the 4 types of phenomena in Black and White, rustling grass has the chance to appear randomly in the overworld and is necessary for encountering certain Pokemon. A majority of the time you'll run into Audino, but in some areas you can encounter rare Pokemon like Musharna, Leavanny, or Stoutland, just to name a few. And unfortunately, Emolga is only encounterable through this method. You can run into it as early as Route 5 right after Nimbasa, but your best chance to find it is on Route 6 past Drift Vale at a 20% encounter rate. This may not seem too bad, but it can get tedious really quick. You're basically running around in circles waiting for rustling grass to appear, and when it does, you're crossing your fingers you can get the 1 out of 5 chance for Emolga, and not the 4 out of 5 chance for literally anything else. You can get lucky on the first try, but you'll often end up running around using a lot of repels just to encounter one. And when you finally do get it, you're severely disappointed. Emolga performs well against Skyla, but every other gym leader left by the time you get it leaves you at a disadvantage. And just like with Watchog, once you start facing fully evolved Pokemon, Emolga's usefulness just plummets. Its matchup against Marshall of the Elite Four is especially funny to me, as literally every one of Marshall's Pokemon has a Rock-type move to completely obliterate it. Now, to be fair, Emolga does have a few things going for it. For one, it learns Acrobatics not long after you obtain it, and a base 110 power stab move definitely comes in handy. Plus, it learns Encore at level 38, which can be one of the most useful status moves in game, especially on a fast Pokemon. Not to mention, it has Static for an ability, and sharing a typing with Zapdos never hurts, as you're only weak to Ice and Rock. Unfortunately, with these stats, Emolga is still weak to basically everything. As far as Pikachu clones go, Emolga is definitely the best thus far in the franchise, but that doesn't mean it's worth using. Personally, I'd recommend any other electric type in this gen. Yes, even Stunfisk. Continuing with the trend of single-stage Pokemon, here we have Alomomola. Out of everything on the list, Alomomola is easily the most confusing of the bunch. For one, it has extremely lopsided stats. You have an astounding 165 HP, a very average 80 defense, and a pitiful 45 special defense. Then you have the ever-popular 75 in attack, a depressing 40 in special attack, and a very subpar 65 in speed. So you're a primarily physically defensive, physically offensive, bulky water. This is pretty shitty, as it makes Alomomola the only water type in the generation that doesn't want to learn Surf, which is typically the best water move you can get. Speaking of Surf, Alomomola is only encountered through another type of phenomena, being Rippling Water, which requires the player to surf over an open water spot. For one, you have to wait until beating Skyla to get the HM for Surf, making Alomomola one of the latest obtainable water types. But the bigger issue is that you need a Pokemon to learn Surf before you can even catch Alomomola. And even if you do go through the effort to catch one, you're left with something really awkward. Alomomola is one of those Pokemon that's severely limited by having only 4 move slots. What it does well is use moves like Toxic, Protect, and Wish to support the team, but then you've pigeonholed it into a very defensive role, and like I've said in the past, that isn't always what you want for an in-game playthrough. But if you try to go with offensive moves like Aqua Jet and Wake Up Slap, for one, you're the person using offensive Alomomola, but more importantly, you're just gonna end up disappointed in the lack of damage you can do. I can't see anybody going out of their way to use Alomomola unless they're intentionally trying to do a more challenging run, like myself. It's pretty ironic that it's the caring Pokemon, because I genuinely don't think anyone cares about Alomomola. I think out of every Pokemon I've mentioned, this one is the least used of them all. Maybe even less than both Maractus and Alomomola. Here we have Heatmor. Oh, Heatmor. For one, the only place you can find Heatmor is in Victory Road. More often than not, players have their full team by the time they reach Victory Road, so Heatmor already has the disadvantage of being super late in the game. It also doesn't help that fire types have some pretty stiff competition in Gen 5 as well. Emboar, Darmanitan, and Chandelure are all much better choices than Heatmor, and are available much earlier as well. You can even make the argument that Simisear is a better fire type, and you know it's bad when the least liked Pokemon of all time is beating you. But even if you isolate Heatmor from all other fire types, it doesn't have a ton going for it. Its stats are really unimpressive. It may have the best offensive presence of anything on this list, but its base 65 speed and subpar defenses really drag it down. And while it has a pretty good move pool, it isn't anything I would say is amazing. Regardless, the first issue is still the biggest, as it's hard to look past its super late availability. Between the 6 big fights at the end of the game, Heatmore is super effective against exactly 4 Pokemon. 2 Bisharps, an Ice Cream Cone, and Klinklang. Even if you go out of your way to use Heatmore on these Pokemon, which I tried to, it still isn't worth it to catch and train up a new Pokemon right before the end of the game. And if you did need another Pokemon by the time you reach Victory Road, you're much better off going with Heatmore's rival, Durant. It has great stats, a fantastic typing, and more positive matchups in the final fights than Heatmore could even dream of. So ironically enough, the Ant is actually better than the Anteater. I've been talking shit on bad Pokemon for 5 generations now, and I think it's finally time to show you firsthand how bad they really are. While you've already watched gameplay footage throughout this video, I decided to go the extra mile and show you how this team of 6 performs in the Elite Four and against N and Ghetsis. And boy, were these battles something. I trained each of these worst Pokemon up to level 48 before entering the Elite Four, said my prayers, and jumped straight in. I decided to battle Marshall first, mostly because I wanted to see if it was even possible to beat him. He starts off with Throw as I let off with Emolga. I immediately go for Acrobatics and do a little over half his health as he throws out a Stone Edge that thankfully misses. After another Acrobatics, Throw goes down. Next up is Sock. I yet again go for Acrobatics, which brings Sock all the way down to Sturdy. Unfortunately, his Stone Edge connects, which is enough to knock out Emolga roughly 5 times over. I bring in Serperior, and Marshall ends up using a full Restore as I launch off a Leaf Blade, doing a little under half. After a bit of back and forth and another full Restore, I eventually knock out Sock, with Serperior at decent HP thanks to Giga Drain. Quick tangent, Sock kept using Stone Edge against me, which threw me off because I figured he would use a fighting type move for more damage. Then I looked it up and realized that this Sock's only fighting move is Karate Chop. Come on Marshall, you're better than that. After Sock goes down, Mienshao ends up coming in. I immediately go for Leech Seed and land as Mienshao says, "F you, I'm using U-turn," and brings me down to 2 HP as he brings in Conkeldurr. I end up getting a critical hit Leaf Blade while in Overgrow that brings Conkeldurr down to about 20% before I get knocked out. I then bring in Maractus and end up knocking out Conkeldurr with Petal Dance, leaving me with 4 Pokemon to use against Mienshao. Should be easy, right? Yeah, about that. Maractus gets one-shot with a crit Jump Kick. Heatmore comes in next, gets flinched by Rock Slide, then also dies to Jump Kick. Alomomola comes in, takes a Jump Kick, misses Toxic, then survives on 12 HP before landing the next one. Thank God. I end up using Protect as Mienshao uses Jump Kick again and crashes, taking out half its health. I then go for Aqua Jet to try and finish it off, and I don't do nearly enough damage and get knocked out myself. Thankfully, with Watchog waiting in the back, Mienshao dies to toxic damage, giving me the win. What a start. The next Elite Four member I decide to fight is Chantal. She leads off with Cofagrigus as I start off with Watchog. I go for a Crunch off the bat, leaving her just over half health as she uses Psychic, leaving me just over half health. After a couple more attacks and Chantal healing up, Watchog faints with Cofagrigus in the red. I send in Emolga and try to knock it out with Acrobatics, but she ends up healing it again. I end up taking a ton of damage from Shadow Ball, but I'm able to knock it out with a couple extra Acrobatics. She then sends in Chandelure as I switch over to Alomomola. I immediately go for Aqua Jet, but don't do a whole lot of damage, and then get burnt by Flame Body and then lose over half my health to Shadow Ball. Nice. After one more Aqua Jet, I end up going down. Thankfully, this allows me to bring in Maractus, who is able to knock out Chandelure with a Sucker Punch. Her next Pokemon is Jellicent, who, after a little back and forth, I knock out with Petal Blizzard. Last up is her Golurk. I end up using Giga Drain to do a little over half its health as it ends up using Curse and she knocks herself out, ending the battle. Well, that was anticlimactic. Hot off the heels of that victory, I end up fighting Caitlyn next. She leads off with Reuniclus as I send in Watchog, trying my best to give him a chance to finally prove himself. I go for Crunch and do just about half and immediately get knocked out by Focus Blast. Well, I tried. I send in Serperior next and go for a Leaf Blade, leaving Reuniclus in the red as I take a ton of damage from Psychic. As she heals up, I go for a couple Giga Drains, with my second one landing a crit. Unfortunately, that crit is immediately returned to me in the form of Psychic, and Serperior goes down. Emolga comes in next and thankfully knocks out Reuniclus with Acrobatics. She then sends in Sigilif and I land a critical hit Spark, surprisingly knocking it out. Next up is her ace Gothitelle. I go for acrobatics again, and while I don't do a ton of damage, thankfully she uses Calm Mind, all but sealing her fate. I go straight for Encore to keep her locked in, and after many turns of whittling her down and reusing Encore when necessary, Gothitelle eventually faints. Her last Pokemon is Musharna, to which I bring in Alomomola. I land Toxic on my first turn, and after a bit of Protect stalling, Alomomola goes down. This does allow me to bring in Heatmor and do just enough damage to not knock it out, never mind. But thankfully Toxic does, leaving us with only one more person to fight. Grimsley is our last fight in the Elite Four, and he's arguably the coolest Elite Four member, which is why I saved him for the very end, of course. He leads off with Scrafty as I send in Emolga. After using Acrobatics and taking surprisingly little damage from Crunch, I'm able to knock it out. After this, I switch out to Superior as he sends in Crocodile. I go for Giga Drain and do a little bit over half as I take very little from Foul Play. Finally, Superior's low attack came in handy. I end up knocking out Crocodile with my next Giga Drain as Grimsley prepares to send in Bisharp. As one of the 4 Pokemon that Heatmor has a good matchup against, I obviously send it in. I'm just barely able to knock it out with 2 Flame Bursts while surviving on 17 HP, which is great. Still doesn't make Heatmor worth it, but at least it did something. I swap back out to Superior as Grimsley sends in his final Pokemon, Liepard. And after a little back and forth, I end up taking it out, making Grimsley the only Elite Four member that I didn't lose any Pokemon to, which I still find really surprising. But these fights were just the warm-up, as I now have the toughest 2 fights left in the game, N and Getsis. After watching a really cool cutscene and traversing through the most ornate building in Pokemon history, I watch another really cool cutscene and catch the Pokemon Pursuant of Truth, Reshiram. And then I immediately throw it in the box because who needs it? The battle starts with N sending out Zekrom as I send out Superior. I go straight for a Leech Seed and thankfully land as I take about a quarter from Fusion Bolt. After spending a few turns whittling each other down, N heals up his Zekrom with a full restore. Come on, man, you're using a legendary. I have a Watchog and an Emolga. Go easy on me. After a few more turns, Superior ends up going down as Zekrom is left with a small amount of health. I decide to send in Maractus and go for Sucker Punch, which doesn't come close to knocking him out, and I die to a Giga Impact. Nice. But since N has to recharge the turn after, I send in Watchog, who ends up taking out Zekrom. You should really appreciate that sentence because you'll never hear it again. N then sends in Klinklang as I switch out to Heatmor. Only it's not Klinklang, it's Zoroark. I swear to God, I know he has a Zoroark, but I get fooled by this every single time. Fortunately, Zoroark misses its next 2 Focus Blasts, which allows me to knock it out. N plans to send in Caracosta next, at which point I realize that I let both of my grass types faint. I decide to send in Emolga and go for Discharge, bringing him down to about a quarter of his health. Unfortunately, his Stone Edge connects, knocking me out about 10 times over. I send Heatmor back in and attempt to knock it out with Dig, which I just barely end up doing. Trust me, I know for a fact that it just barely did the job. N brings in Archeops next as I switch to Alomomola. I go for Aqua Jet, leaving it over half health as I take some big damage from Stone Edge. Thankfully, my next Aqua Jet puts it in Defeatist range, which didn't actually end up mattering because he missed the next Stone Edge anyways. I then use one more Aqua Jet to knock him out. Next is his actual Klinklang, meaning that Heatmor needs to try and earn its place again. I live a Flash Cannon and do some decent damage with Flame Burst before getting absolutely obliterated with Hyper Beam. Talk about overkill. I send Alomomola back in to go for Surf, mainly to show you why you should never use Surf on Alomomola. Thankfully with Aqua Jet, I'm able to knock out Klinklang the next turn. N then brings out his last Pokemon, Vanillux. He goes for Hail as I end up missing Toxic. Nice. He goes for Flash Cannon after as I thankfully land my next one. You know what's next. Protect! Knowing I won't survive the next attack, I pull out my secret strategy. Hey, if he can heal his Zekrom, I think I should be allowed to heal Alomomola. Thank you. He then goes for a Blizzard, which does a surprising amount for a resisted hit. I then go for Protect again, and it fails because I forgot about the rules with using items and Protect back to back. I then go for Aqua Jet, hoping that between its damage and poison damage, I'll get the win. Well, that's awkward. I then send in my last Pokemon, Watchog. At this point, I know I won't outspeed, and I know Blizzard will knock me out, and I'll lose. But Watchog f***ing dodges! Let's go! Unfortunately, this is no time for celebration, as I have my final opponent, Getsis, on the horizon. He starts with Cofagrigus, as I yet again start off with my Serperior. I go for a Leech Seed to start, and thankfully connect as he goes for Shadow Ball. I then use Giga Drain as he ends up landing a Toxic. After bringing it down to red health, I swap into the GOAT, Watchog, as Getsis uses a full restore. I throw off a Confuse Ray, praying to the RNG gods, as he ends up hitting himself in confusion. I go for Crunch, doing a really unimpressive damage for a super effective hit, as he hits himself in confusion again. Let's go, Watchog! This allows me to knock him out with one more Crunch, leaving Watchog at full health. As Getsis prepares to send in Hydreigon, I go into Alomomola. After losing a majority of my health to Dragon Pulse, I am able to land a Toxic. I go for Protect to rack up some damage, as I swap to Watchog the next turn to sacrifice it. But to my sheer amazement, Watchog lived the Dragon Pulse at 17 HP. Then, like an idiot, Getsis goes for Focus Blast, misses, and I'm able to hit him with a return. While I do get knocked out by Dragon Pulse the following turn, Hydreigon also feints to Toxic damage. So if you really think about it, Watchog knocked out both Zekrom and Hydreigon. Maybe it isn't a bad Pokemon. After the double down, I send in Emolga as he sends in Bouffalant. I go for Acrobatics to get as much damage as I can, as I get sent to the Shadow Realm with a Head Charge. I then bring in Serperior and go for Giga Drain to get a little HP back. And while I did get enough HP to live the next head charge, I unfortunately fainted to poison damage. I then send in Maractus and am able to finish it off with a Sucker Punch. Then, again, like an idiot, he brings in Seismitoad, which I'm able to one-shot with Giga Drain. Getsis then sends in his penultimate Pokemon, Electros. I go straight for a Petal Dance and do just over half before getting brought down to 10 HP from Flamethrower. Thankfully, this allows me to knock him out the next turn, leaving him with just Bisharp, to which I switch into Heatmore. I try to go for Flame Burst, but unfortunately I get knocked out with a critical hit Stone Edge. I then send Alomomola back in and go for Aqua Jet to get a bit of damage, before getting hit with Night Slash and living on 3 HP. I then went for Protect, I guess to stall the non-existent timer? I don't know. It didn't end up mattering, because I still got knocked out the next turn anyways. Then I sent back in my final Pokemon, Maractus, on 13 HP. I go for Sucker Punch, which does nowhere near enough damage, and then I get knocked out, losing the battle. Or so I thought, because through the power of Divine Intervention, and totally not a max revive from my bag, Heatmore comes back to life to prove its worthiness on the team. Bisharp goes for Stone Edge, but this time I live on 16 HP, which allows me to use Flame Burst and do just enough damage to knock out Are you kidding me? Man, f*** this. Hopefully that was a good display for you of why you should not use these Pokemon. They may not be completely terrible, but it's safe to say that they're quite literally the worst Gen 5 Pokemon. Thanks so much for watching. It's been too long since I've done one of these, so I really wanted to make sure it was a good one. Be sure to subscribe if you made it this far, and let me know in the comments who you think the worst Gen 5 Pokemon is. Whew, after all that, I think I need to take a nap, and maybe apologize to Watchog, because it did do pretty well. So for now, as thanks for making it to the end of the video, here's a picture of my dog. Talk to y'all soon.